Hello, and welcome to the Science Bloggers podcast. Today, I have two guests with me, James Rosenthal and Charlie Kelly, graduate students at the University of Washington and hosts of the Paper Boys podcast. Both James and Charlie analyze the research papers behind the news and give us details that the news outlets don't cover. So, hello guys, how are you?
Good. Thanks for having us on the show.
Yeah, happy to be here.
Okay, glad to have you. So why don't we start off, whoever wants to go first can introduce yourselves and tell the listeners what you do.
I'm James. I'm currently a PhD student in electrical engineering at the University of Washington, studying wireless electronics, and specifically wireless electronics for biomedical devices such as brain-computer interfaces.
And my name's Charlie. I am also a PhD student at the University of Washington. I'm in the Aeronautics and Astronautics department studying electric propulsion and plasma physics and deep space orbiter technologies.
Wow, sounds impressive. So you both do a podcast, Paper Boys. Why don't you tell us about that?
Yeah, so our podcast, Paper Boys, we've been doing for the last, month and a half, 2 months or so. And what we do is we find headline science news stories, and then we actually research the paper that the news is based on. So we dive into the journal, get all the references, and find out about the authors and the methods behind this research. And then we relay all of that on our show and use that information to sort of identify where the news is getting things wrong and where the news is getting things right.
So what exactly is the origin story for Paper Boys?
It was really bred, I guess, out of an idea that Charlie and myself had when we started graduate school. I guess going back a little further, we started at the University of Washington on the same day and met at orientation, and we were hanging out and talking about it'd be fun to do just sort of a random journal club, meet up for drinks or something and talk about one paper a week, and just to sort of expand our own horizons as we were getting into research, look at what other research is going on out there. Because you can really learn a lot from different papers, especially when they're outside of your field, just to learn about research methods and different human biases that go into research. And then we ended up doing a radio show last year just for fun as a way to kind of break up our research schedule and do something a little left-minded in our free time. And then it just sort of merged from that, sort of a fun creative outlet for learning more about research and doing something fun in the media and engaging the audience. And I think one thing we've really realized as graduate students now, too, is the more and more we read about science media, it seems like even just the language often talks about they or researchers, like they're this group of people sort of like in the dungeon, far away from society. But we sort of, in the process of developing the podcast, really kind of came up with this sub-goal of wanting to humanize research and showing like researchers are fallible and doing their best. And there's a lot of just really brilliant experiments out there, but it's interesting to dive in and see the human side of it.
So how exactly do you go about, choosing the articles that you talk about?
A couple different ways. Sometimes we just scroll through different news websites like New York Times, CNN, and various other sources, especially like things like Popular Science, which spread a lot of science media. And then I would be lying if I said we weren't a little bit biased sometimes. We're both pretty big space geeks, so we are definitely attracted to certain stories like that, but we do try to do a pretty even spread across different disciplines.
In general, do you think news outlets are getting the stories right, or do you think they can do better?
Well, that's what we're trying to get to the bottom of. It really depends episode to episode. Sometimes we find that it's pretty good, actually. Let's see, what was the latest episode that I recorded?
I think spiders?
No, what was?
This was the, I'm totally blanking.
Sorry.
Oh, this was the magnet.
Oh, yeah.
One.
So there was a recent episode that we had where there was a record magnetic field produced in this lab in Japan. And most of the news stories were totally spot on with it. They made a good point of giving all the caveats to what the world record for magnetic field actually meant. There was maybe only 1 or 2 lines in one article that were a little bit suspect. Whereas we've done other ones. We have an episode coming up actually about terraforming Mars. And some of the news articles are actually kind of insulting. Like they call the readers nerds for wanting Mars to be terraformed, and they say that stuff about how Elon Musk is going to be out of a job and just things that are completely unrelated to what was actually studied in these papers. And you can tell that in those cases, you can tell that the journalists didn't really go beyond the abstract of a given paper and maybe didn't even do their due diligence on who was performing the studies. Because a lot of times they'll say new NASA research has shown this when it's not actually a NASA study. Those are the cases where we really like to pick apart those news stories and show what's wrong with them.
Wow. So how long does it take for you to prepare a story or an episode?
Generally, I'd say we put in probably at least a good 3 to 4 hours before each episode. We alternate each week between Charlie and myself, between who's presenting a paper. So we usually take a couple hours to find the different news sources. Usually when one of these articles comes up online, several different news media outlets cover them. So it's nice to get a range of perspectives to see how different research is presented in the media. Sometimes we see some pretty interesting contradictions, like with our recent podcast on microwave weapons at the U.S. Embassy. A few of the news sources were actually pretty contradictory, so that was interesting to find. And then diving in usually into one or two of the main papers that are cited and trying to get into some of the references too. So by the time you actually read the papers and try to wrap your brain around it, you're a couple hours in.
Yeah, it can really vary episode to episode too. The episode that we did on goats recognizing human emotions was pretty straightforward. I just read that one paper and then I dug into a little bit of research that these scientists had done before, but there wasn't a whole lot of extensive background research for that one. Whereas the episode with spiders flying, I found a source that was a book from 1830, and it just was so fascinating that I went and I read a couple chapters out of that book. And so that took up a couple hours of time, but it was totally worth it and was just a really fun exercise for me. So
yeah, I remember when that flying spiders story came out. I know biologists have said probably for over a century that spiders can do this, but we never fully understood, how they could do it. Does anyone want to go over it, the physics behind it, just as a recap?
Yeah. So what was really funny about that article. So what the journal paper found is that there's this phenomenon called ballooning in spiders where they will launch out a strand of silk and then that strand of silk will be caught in the wind or something and they can actually fly away. And so sometimes they'll find spiders hundreds of miles from where they are supposed to be found. For example, these sailors back in the 1800s would find spiders caught in their sails when they're hundreds of miles from shore, and they know that they're coming from the wind. And so when you look through the literature on ballooning and spiders, almost everything that you find identifies the mechanism as aerodynamic drag, catching the silk, and because the spider is so light, it's able to blow away. And all the research is on what regimes of wind speeds and atmospheric conditions could cause this. And then this new paper came along that said, actually, the mechanism behind this is electrostatic forces. So the silk is actually building up a charge from just the electrons in the air around it. And then when there's a storm or very cloudy weather, you can build up a very strong electric field just in the atmosphere, like surrounding a tree or a plant. And that electric field imparts a force on the charged silk and can send the spider flying. And so they were able to prove that that is actually the mechanism behind this. So like you said, for hundreds of years, they have been looking at wind as the mechanism. And then this one paper overturns that whole theory. And when we went back to the book that first started to report this phenomenon, the author of that book actually said, I think it's electric forces. And then everyone after him said, no, it's the wind. And the entire scientific field got caught up in this aerodynamic effect.
I guess that's how science works. Sometimes we revisit old ideas that we thought were incorrect because the evidence points in that direction. But it's been a while since I looked at that story, but I remember one of the things that, the electrostatic idea solved was that some spiders were able to start ballooning when there's no wind, right? And that's something that the aerodynamic drag theory could not, solve.
Yeah. The other really interesting thing from all of that was that they have been able to see that spiders, behaved differently in response to different weather conditions, or rather ahead of different weather conditions. So the spiders were able to, they could observe that the webs were being built in different ways. And by seeing the specific way they built their web, they would know that tomorrow was going to be a rainy day, or it's going to be clear for another week. And so there was some evidence already that spiders were able to detect more subtle things in the atmosphere than just something like the wind speed. And this paper really, I think, brings together all of these different, very fascinating phenomena that you see with these spiders' lives. Brings it all together into one sort of theory that says, yeah, they're able to detect electric fields and use them.
Who's your intended audience?
That's something we are still trying to hone in on, because our intended audience is, I think, very broadly anyone who's science-minded and who's interested in science. But it's hard to sometimes straddle the line of how technical do you want to get when you're talking about a given paper, like especially when we get into papers that are in our own field with a lot of this planetary science stuff or plasma physics kind of thing. It can be really easy to get off into the weeds and maybe alienate people who aren't hard scientists themselves. But I don't think we have any illusions that we're attracting completely broad audience. I mean, honestly, I think a lot of our listeners are other grad students like ourselves, because I think part of what James mentioned about this mission of trying to humanize research maybe connects with some people who would like to feel understood as in their career.
I think one of the other things about talking about research papers and having other, students listen to it is that, they get a better idea of the research process, how to take apart a paper and analyze it. And that's part of what being in grad school is about. It's figuring out how to read a paper.
Yeah, and I think that that's part of, James mentioned that we've had this idea since we first got to grad school. I don't think that we could have started this podcast when we got here, because it has honestly taken me these 2 years to learn how to even read a paper and really discern what it all means and be able to pick out the relevant information. So it's a good thing that we're doing this when we are now. And hopefully, like you said, we can sort of show by example that it's not daunting to dive into these journals yourself and how you can actually go about picking out the information you need to pick out.
Do you have any plans to look at papers outside of your fields of specialization, or are you going to mostly focus on what you guys both do research in?
Yeah, that's a great question. Yeah, we are really trying to broaden the papers that we cover, making sure that they are outside of our domain. Certain stories come up, of course, that are just too good to pass up, especially like there's the recent discovery of, they thought, a lake under the surface of Mars, and so that was really fascinating. And that was a lot with radar, which is pretty similar to my field of research. But we covered one on the effects of pollution on cognition that was really more an economics and sociology-based research paper. So that was definitely personally out of my comfort zone, but it was interesting to dive into. And I think we'll get better and better at getting a broader look on these papers. It's challenging for sure, because every paper and every subdiscipline has its own language and jargon. So it takes a lot of effort to really get up to speed quickly in the time that we turn out the episodes. But yeah, I think we're going to continue making a solid effort to keep our stories pretty broad so that whoever is listening, whatever their background and interests, may find something that they would like to listen to.
Sounds like a worthwhile goal. So
we hope so.
Yeah. So do you have any future plans for the podcast? Any future direction you'd like things to be in?
I'm not sure. We don't I wouldn't say we have super lofty goals. I mean, we get very excited every time we get a single listen to the show. And so it's like every day is very exciting, just checking to see that people are actually listening to what we do. And so I think loose goal of just keep continuing to grow the show is on our minds for sure.
One thing we are thinking of adding on in the upcoming episodes, in line with our goal of humanizing research, we're going to start doing just a short little highlight of different grad students across the world, bringing them on for a quick segment to talk about their own research, just to sort of show the diversity that is within the research community, both in ideas and backgrounds and interests. So we're excited about that, those highlights. And yeah, I guess we were curious from our side as a listener what you might be interested to hear in any future episodes as someone who's actually listened to our podcast, if you don't mind us turning the question around.
Oh, no, you can turn the question around. I think one of the things you can do is look at the popular stories that are in the media, right? So a couple weeks ago, there was this story on glyphosate killing bees. And, when you look at the science behind it, I'm probably not an expert, so I can't comment on too much on it. There were a lot of comments on social media, in Reddit, of how bad that paper was. And I think, looking at some of these popular stories, looking at some of these really terrible papers that are out there, can be really beneficial to the public and, to graduate students as well, right? Analyzing a good paper is just as beneficial as analyzing some of the really terrible papers out there. So that's one suggestion that I can think of, if that makes sense.
Yeah, no, I think that makes a lot of sense. You're right that attacking the ones that are getting the most popular attention it's absolutely in line with our mission here, and it's a very good way to go about finding these stories. I mean, that's how the whole anti-vaccination movement started, was I think one paper that linked vaccines with autism, and then that paper got spread around these groups so much. And then even the doctor who I think originally wrote that study has since denounced it, but it gained so much social traction at the time that people are not willing to let go of this idea. So if we can try to attack those things right at the source, when papers like that come out and get so much attention, then hopefully we can make at least a tiny little difference in allowing people to be more discerning with what they read.
Yeah, exactly. And, to be fair to the public, a lot of the information out there is highly specialized, right? So we cannot say that, oh, well, they should know better. They don't, to figure this out, you need, in many cases, years of schooling, you need years of specialization, and they don't have that. They just want to make sense of the world around them. And having a knowledgeable source talk about this might be helpful.
Yeah, and that's sort of the key behind this idea of humanizing the researchers. Is a lot of these stories you'll see the news outlet is applying this sense of authority to science by saying researchers have shown, or scientists have shown, or NASA study shows, by disengaging it from the real actual people that did these studies. I mean, we being PhD students ourselves, many of these studies are actually, most of the work and the writing is done by other PhD students. So walking around our halls, we're not looking at all these other people like they're gods that need to be trusted at their word. The whole scientific process you mentioned earlier is it's sort of this slow churning beast where we're going to get some stuff wrong and eventually it'll have to be overturned to be right. But just because it's out there right now doesn't mean that it's the end all be all. It just means that you need to continue that line of questioning.
So back to something that you had mentioned earlier, that you might be looking for other students, other scientists to appear on your podcast. The podcast is actually an offshoot of a science communications Facebook group. So we do have quite a few graduate student science communicators. So I can send you guys a link and you can check the group out. How does that sound?
That would be great. We would love that. It'd be great just to get more engaged too with the scientific community like that and other graduate students. So yeah, if you don't mind, we would love that.
Awesome. I'll be sure to send a link. So I think we can start concluding. Is there anything else you'd like to say that I didn't give you a chance to say?
I don't think so. No, I mean, we really appreciate the opportunity to talk about the show and to come onto your show and hopefully get through to some of your listeners and your Facebook group.
Yeah, just really appreciate the opportunity and love to put out a good word for your show too. I think it's been really insightful for both Charlie and myself, having started this podcast fairly recently, just to see how really welcoming the community is and engaging they are. And it's great. It's great to see what's possible with modern social media. I think it's one of the highlights of social media, especially right now with all there's a lot of negative press on social media, but to actually see the different engagement and the diversity of people who are really interested in science and research is great to see.
Yeah, awesome. And I know you guys have some meetings to go to, so I don't want to keep you any longer. Thank you for doing this. I appreciate having you here. It's been fun.
Yeah, it's been a ton of fun. Thanks so much for having us on.
Yeah.
Okay, you guys. I hope you both have a good day.
You too.
You too. Thanks a lot.
And that was James and Charlie, hosts of the Paper Boys podcast. Check them out if you're looking for insightful analysis of academic papers in the news. Links have been provided in the show notes. I hope you enjoyed this episode of the Science Bloggers podcast. Be sure to subscribe or leave a comment on what you thought or what you would like to see in future episodes.